The phone rang just as the late autumn rain began to hammer against the window of my small apartment in Portland. I had been staring at a half-written proposal on my laptop, the cursor blinking like a tiny pulse of accusation, when the vibration startled me. The caller ID flashed Ashley and I hesitated before answering. My sister never called unless something was wrong, or unless she needed to remind me in her perfectly polite way how far I'd fallen behind in life. Her voice came through sharp and efficient, the way she always sounded when she was in control of something. "Melissa, we're having a family meeting. You need to come home. Mom fell and broke her hip and Dad's getting worse. The doctor says it's progressing faster than they expected." There was a long silence before I managed to say anything. I could hear the faint echo of conversation in the background. Probably her husband, the sound of dishes, the clinking of a life well organized. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. "Of course," I said, even though I knew she could hear the reluctance in my voice. "I'll get a flight." Ashley sighed. "Good. And Melissa, try not to make it a big deal. We just need to figure things out, practically speaking. Oh, and maybe rent a decent car this time, okay?" She laughed lightly as if it were a joke. "You don't want the neighbors thinking you drove here in that rusted heap again." I wanted to tell her that my car ran just fine, that it was paid off, that I didn't need a gleaming machine to prove I was doing okay, but I didn't. I just said, "Sure," and hung up. The truth was, I had barely enough in my checking account to cover a last-minute ticket to Harmony Hills, that small Oregon town I'd tried so hard to forget. The startup I'd been working on, a platform for sustainable local artisans, had dried up after our investor pulled out 6 months ago. I'd been freelancing since then, taking whatever marketing gigs I could find, pretending to my friends that things were picking up. But my fridge held only a few wilted vegetables and my rent was late again. I sat on the couch, staring at the dim reflection of myself in the black screen of my laptop. The same tired face, the same faint line between my eyebrows that seemed deeper each year. It felt like Ashley's words hung in the air long after the call ended. "You don't want the neighbors thinking you drove here in that rusted heap again." When I finally packed, I did it mechanically. A few sweaters, my worn jeans, the laptop I couldn't afford to replace, and a notebook full of unfinished ideas. I booked the cheapest flight I could find and tried not to think about the credit card balance that was already climbing too high. Harmony Hills hadn't changed much when I arrived. The same neat rows of houses with trimmed lawns and shiny SUVs parked in driveways, the same gray fog that rolled down from the hills in the mornings, giving everything that cold, washed-out look. My parents' house stood at the end of a quiet street lined with maple trees that had already shed most of their leaves. I could see the porch light glowing faintly through the mist, like a beacon I wasn't sure I wanted to reach. Ashley's SUV was already there, parked perfectly by the curb. I sat for a moment in the rental car, an old compact model that smelled faintly of stale air freshener, and tried to steady my breathing. Every visit felt like stepping back into a role I didn't want anymore, the youngest daughter, the dreamer, the one who never grew up. When I walked in, the smell hit me first. A mix of antiseptic and lavender, the scent of aging and effort. Ashley was in the kitchen, arranging medication bottles in a perfect row. "Finally," she said without looking up. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come." "I said I would," I replied quietly. She glanced up and gave me that smile. Tight, controlled, the kind she used when she was trying not to say something sharper. "Tired? Work keeping you busy?" I shrugged. "Something like that." Her eyes flicked toward my shoes, damp and muddy from the walk up the driveway. "You could have at least changed before coming in." Before I could respond, Mom called from the living room. Her voice was weaker than I remembered, and when I saw her sitting in the recliner with her leg in a cast, a wave of guilt washed over me. She smiled when she saw me, her eyes crinkling the way they used to when I was little. "Lizzie, you came. Oh, sweetheart, it's been so long." I knelt beside her, trying not to cry. "Hey, Mom. You scared me." She laughed softly. "Just a silly fall. These old bones aren't what they used to be." Dad was in the corner staring out the window. His once sharp eyes were cloudy now, his hands twitching slightly as he rubbed at the armrest. When I said hello, he turned and looked at me as if trying to place my face. "Melissa," he said finally, his voice uncertain. "You look just like your mother did when we met." That simple sentence broke something in me. I smiled and squeezed his hand, pretending not to notice how thin it felt. Ashley moved behind me, still brisk and efficient. "Doctor says we'll need to start considering long-term care," she said, as if announcing a business plan. "I've already looked into some options nearby, but Mom insists on staying here for now." Mom gave her a look. "This is my home, Ashley. I'm not going anywhere." Ashley sighed. "See. Anyway, we'll talk about all that later. I'm making dinner." She turned back toward the kitchen, leaving me kneeling beside Mom, the smell of roasted vegetables filling the silence. The evening stretched on quietly after that. I helped set the table, trying to ignore the tension that hung between Ashley and me like invisible smoke. She talked about her job, her new house, her kids' achievements. Every detail was polished, perfect. I nodded, smiled, pretended to care, but inside I felt myself shrinking. When she finally asked about me, how my projects were going, it wasn't out of curiosity but out of obligation. "Still doing that online business thing?" she said lightly, pouring herself another glass of wine. "Trying to, yeah," I said. "It's been a rough year." Her mouth curved in that sympathetic way that wasn't really sympathy at all. "Well, you're creative. I'm sure you'll figure something out. Not everyone's cut out for stability." The words stung more than they should have. I looked at Mom, who was watching us quietly, her eyes tired but kind. She reached for my hand under the table and squeezed it. That small gesture was enough to keep me from breaking. Later that night, after Ashley had gone upstairs to call her husband, I stepped outside onto the porch. The air was cold, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. I looked out over the quiet street, the faint glow of windows, the sound of leaves rustling in the dark. I thought about the word Ashley had used so casually, stability, and wondered when it had become the measure of a life's worth. Maybe I was poor. Maybe I was lost. But standing there, with the fog curling around the lampposts and the soft hum of crickets rising from the grass, I felt something else too, a quiet, stubborn defiance. They could see me as the failure, the dreamer, the youngest who never figured it out. But I knew the truth. I hadn't given up. I was still trying even if no one else saw it. By morning the house had settled into the rhythm it always defaulted to when the older children were in orbit. A rhythm that sounded like efficient footsteps and decisive voices, and a kind of practiced choreography where someone like me was expected to slide into the negative space and not knock into the furniture. And when I came into the kitchen, Ashley was already dressed in a crisp blouse that did not admit wrinkles as a possibility, spooning yogurt into a glass bowl as if she were plating a dish at a hotel buffet and taking calls on her earbuds, her cadence clipped and glossy while I stood barefoot on the cool tile and tried to recall if I had ever spoken with that same unshakable certainty. And then I heard the familiar growl of an expensive engine in the driveway and felt the old anticipatory flutter in my stomach that Jonathan had inspired in me since I was small and convinced that whatever he did must be right simply because he did it. He swept in on a current of aftershave and outdoor air, taller than I remembered and a little more solid through the middle, wearing a sport coat the color of wet bark, the kind of fabric that suggested it had never met rain or coffee stains, and he hugged Mom carefully around the cast as if he'd rehearsed it and then clasped Dad's shoulder with both hands, speaking directly into his line of sight the way the pamphlet said to do, and only after that did his eyes land on me with a quick brightening that had less warmth than assessment, a look that flicked from my thrifted sweater to my scuffed suitcase in the hall and then back to my face as if ticking boxes on a form. He smiled the way closers smile at an open house, palms out, voice pitched to reassure, and said, "There she is, the prodigal innovator," and laughed, and I laughed too even though the word prodigal burrowed uneasily under my skin because I knew he meant it as affectionate teasing but I also knew he liked words that sounded expensive and a little biblical, as if success were a covenant he had kept and the rest of us either had or hadn't, and he motioned for me to follow him to the porch where he could talk without Ashley's call bleeding into the background. He rested his forearms on the railing and faced the street, the hills rising in tidy folds beyond the cul-de-sac like a screensaver set to pastoral, and he started telling me about the last 3 houses he'd sold, all view lots, all going above asking, all to people who were really our kind of neighbors, and I let the cadence of his success wash over me because it was easier than holding it back, the details spilling out in careful abundance, square footage and HOA amenities in school district rankings, and then, almost in the same breath, he said that he and Mara had been talking about Mom and Dad and logistics and that while of course we wanted to honor their wishes we also needed to be realistic and think about care, costs, safety, and I nodded because I did want that. I wanted safety and dignity and all the words people say around elder care when they are trying not to say money, and then he slid his gaze toward me and said gently that Ashley had a lot on her plate, the commute, the team she was managing, the travel, and that he had clients in the little one's schedules and charity boards and a renovations timeline, but that we would all contribute, obviously, and that he knew I had flexibility right now, the word landing soft as down and just as smothering, and before I could answer he squeezed my shoulder and said he knew how much my projects meant to me and that it would be great if I could be here for a bit and help stabilize things, and I felt at once seen and not seen at all, as if my entire life had been translated into a convenience, a shape that fit their grid. Ashley slipped onto the porch then, the call ended, the perfect bowl of yogurt left behind and stood between us like a hinge, and I noticed how she arranged herself so the sunlight caught her hair in a way that looked unstudied, and she said that Jonathan and she had been comparing calendars and could I stay at least a few weeks, maybe more, just until we had a plan, and she used the same tone she used when she scheduled Q4 deliverables, a tone that presupposed yes and left the edges of no too. sharp to touch, and I said I could stay for now because the truth was I had no reason not to, no office calling me back, no investors waiting for a deck, no launch date circled in red, and I felt the heat rise in my face as if I had confessed a small shame, which in this family it was. Inside, the hierarchy asserted itself the way old wallpaper bleeds through new paint. Jonathan drifted toward Dad with a practiced steadiness, getting him to take a short walk down the hall and back, praising every step like a coach, while Ashley began assembling a spreadsheet on her laptop at the dining table, typing with an aggressive neatness, color-coding tasks and timelines, and I hovered with a dish towel and a pitcher of water and a dozen unspecific good intentions that felt flimsy next to their accomplished competence. Jonathan narrated his world as he moved, little updates about the house on Ridgeview with the troublesome retaining wall, the vineyard fundraiser he and Mara would host in 2 weeks, the foundation gala where he was co-chairing the silent auction, and Ashley chimed in with brisk notes about a campaign that had hit its KPIs, a flight to Napa for a client tasting, a new suit she had tailored because the old one had become too stiff for travel, and they were not bragging exactly, they were simply breathing the air of their altitude, and I kept waiting for there to be room for my thin oxygen, for the small story of a bug I had fixed at 2 a.m. or the way a municipal parcel database had surprised me with its wicked elegance, but it wasn't that kind of room. Mom watched the 3 of us with an expression that was both fond and faintly amused, a look I recognized from childhood when she knew a current would carry us where we were already headed and her best gift was to stay out of the undertow. And when I brought her tea she patted the couch beside her and said softly that my hair had grown, that it made me look like the college version of myself, the one who stayed up late in the dining hall explaining why compost mattered, and I laughed because it was easier than crying and told her compost still mattered, and she squeezed my fingers as if confirming that I still did too. Dad dozed in his chair and startled awake every so often to ask the time or where his keys were, and Jonathan answered each question as if it were the first time, patient and steady, and I felt something unclench in me because whatever else could be said about my brother, he was gentle with our father now. By noon Jonathan insisted on taking us to see his house because fresh air would be good for Dad and because he wanted to show Mom the new stonework on the terrace, and even though I felt like I should stay and finish the to-do list Ashley was building, I was swept along by the tide of their certainty, out to the driveway, into Jonathan's SUV that smelled faintly of leather and citrus. Dad buckled in with a plaid blanket over his knees. The road up to the ridge was as smooth as a pitch, the houses spaced with curated generosity, each one angled to catch an exact slice of view as if the hills were a rare artwork being divided in equitable shares. And when we pulled into Jonathan's place I felt a tightness in my throat that was not envy exactly but a recognition of how completely he had planted his flag in the landscape of the town that had trained us. The house spread low and deliberate across the lot, cedar and glass and a roofline so clean it looked like a line drawn with a sharp pencil. And inside everything smelled new, the saffron of fresh wood and the cool mineral breath of stone. And he moved through the rooms with the pride of someone who had imagined a life and then negotiated it into existence one contract at a time. On the terrace the view unrolled in layered greens, vineyards like stitching across the slopes, the river a thread of dull silver, and Mara's curated planters lined the rail, each pot an essay in restraint. And while Mom admired the stonework Jonathan explained the masonry as if he had laid each piece himself, and I watched the way the edges of his sentences softened around Mom, the way he kept his back to the drop so Dad wouldn't have to look at it if it made him dizzy, and I felt an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with approval and everything to do with relief. They could be cruel in their casual comparisons, my siblings, but they were not careless with the people we loved. We ate lunch at the long kitchen island with its waterfall counter that glowed like a well-lit stage, and the conversation bent around me the way water flows around a stone. Ashley and Jonathan pinged shorthand across projects and commitments, meal trains and visiting nurse agencies, PERS and Medicare, the cadence fluent and slightly theatrical, and when they turned to me it was to ask if I still had that app idea for municipal emissions reporting, because perhaps there was a grant somewhere or a pilot, and I nodded and tried to explain where it had stalled, how the data ingestion pipeline had choked on inconsistent formats and how I'd been working on a translation layer that could learn the quirks of each county's exports. And their faces went blank in the way of people who speak dollars not code, so I pivoted to saying it was essentially a tool for small towns to understand where to spend their limited climate budgets. And Ashley brightened and said that was a narrative that she could sell a narrative, and then her brightness dimmed half a stop and she asked lightly whether there was a market willing to pay, a fair question delivered like a verdict. When we returned to our parents' house the afternoon had cooled to that damp balm the valley specializes in, and the living room took on the hush of a weekday sanctuary, the quilts straightened, the medication chart printed and taped to the side of a cupboard, Ashley's spreadsheet open like a command center, and I took a deep breath and asked what needed doing first, expecting a tidy list of calls and errands, and Ashley gave me a quick grateful smile that landed like a benediction I was embarrassed to want. and then she handed me a sheaf of forms, insurance and release and physical therapy intake, and asked me to fill what I could and call the rest. And for the next few hours I moved through the house as if I had always lived in the quiet seams of it, collecting birth dates and policy numbers, tracking down Dad's scattered file folders, texting Jonathan a photo of the pill bottle so he could ask his neighbor the pharmacist a question, reading to Mom the instructions for shower chairs and stair rails, my voice steady even when the pages blurred. As dusk thinned the windows, Ashley poured wine and Jonathan brewed coffee, and I sat at the table and realized with a small, stubborn flicker of pride that while they were the elder stars of our family sky, burning bright and unignorable, there was a gravity to the work I had done that afternoon. A quiet competence that did not announce itself with fundraising galas or panoramic views but held the day together. And when Jonathan slid a plate of roasted chicken in front of me, he said thanks. Really, and when Ashley glanced up from her laptop she said, I knew you'd be good at the details. The words simple but, in her mouth, rare. Later, when the house had folded into evening and Dad's breathing had settled and Mom's hand was warm in mine, I thought about the stratified order that had always defined us, the way Jonathan's certainty took up air and Ashley's polish threw off light, and how, as the youngest, I had learned to move in the penumbra, to invent my own illumination from more fragile sources, and I realized that their definition of home had always included themselves at the center, that they were the ones who stayed, who hosted, who belonged by right of age and accomplishment, and that I was the migratory one, the guest who might or might not be there for Thanksgiving, the one whose address was an ever-changing variable, and yet sitting there in the faded armchair with a stack of forms complete and a plan for the morning, I felt for the first time in a long while, not like a misfit orbiting the family planet but like a piece of its terrain, ordinary and necessary, and if that terrain was not the glossy hillside of Jonathan's world or the curated tasting room of Ashley's calendar, it was still ground, it was still ours. And the knowledge settled in me with the quiet density of something that does not need to be said to be true. I remember the night I told them I wasn't going to college as clearly as if it were sealed inside glass, every detail suspended in that breathless stillness that follows an unexpected confession. We were sitting in the dining room after dinner, the table still cluttered with the remnants of roast chicken and mashed potatoes, the smell of butter and rosemary hanging in the air like an afterthought, and I had rehearsed the sentence all afternoon until the words felt smooth and brave on my tongue. When I finally said it, I've decided not to apply to college. I'm going to start my own company. It landed like a stone in a pond that refused to ripple. For a moment no one moved. The clock on the wall kept ticking, absurdly loud, marking time through their silence. My father's fork was still halfway to his mouth, and I watched it tremble slightly before he set it down with the slow precision of a man adjusting to bad news. He cleared his throat once, twice, the sound rough as gravel. That's not a path for a serious person, he said finally, not looking at me but at the space just over my shoulder, as if the idea itself were too fragile to meet his eyes. My mother's reaction came like a second wave. She pressed her napkin to her lips and whispered something I couldn't make out before the tears started. Why can't you be more like Jonathan? She asked, her voice small but edged with the despair of someone watching a structure they built begin to lean. He worked so hard. He followed through. He made something of himself. Jonathan, of course, didn't look surprised. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, that calm, confident half-smile that had always irritated me hovering on his face. Startups, he said after a pause, rolling the word around as though testing its flavor. That's for dreamers who watch too much YouTube. He chuckled softly and reached for his wine. But hey, if you're just doing this to get it out of your system, go ahead. Everyone needs a hobby before real life starts. Something inside me hardened then, like wet clay turning to stone. I had expected resistance, maybe even disappointment, but not the casual dismissal that reduced my hope to a teenage whim. I remember gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles ached, staring at the flickering candle in the center and thinking, this is the exact moment they decided what I am worth. And I also remember the flash of defiance that followed right after. The stubborn certainty that I would prove them all wrong, that I would make something real out of nothing but my own persistence. That night, while they slept, I sat at my desk with a secondhand laptop and pages of messy sketches, trying to fit my vision into lines of code and diagrams that made sense. The idea had come to me months earlier when I volunteered at a local recycling initiative, a digital platform that could track community waste streams, optimize recycling routes, and connect small businesses with suppliers who use sustainable materials. It was messy and idealistic and far too ambitious for a girl who had just turned 18, but it felt alive in my head, pulsing with purpose in a way no college brochure ever had. I didn't have funding or mentors or even proper equipment. What I had was an old desktop running on borrowed Wi-Fi and an unshakable belief that intention could be a kind of capital. I built mock-ups in open-source software, read documentation until my eyes burned, and wrote cold emails to people who never replied. I printed my first prototype on the back of leftover math worksheets, drew wireframes with a black marker and gave it a name, Greenlink. It was supposed to be about connection, about closing the loop between effort and impact. I told Jonathan about it one afternoon, maybe because some part of me still wanted his approval, or maybe because I thought he would finally see that my hobby had a pulse. He listened, or at least he pretended to. I remember sitting on the back porch explaining the system to him. The database structure, the municipal partnerships, how local businesses could track and offset their waste output. He nodded, asked a few questions that sounded smart but not curious, and said, "It's clever, Liz, but how does it make money?" When I told him I hadn't figured that out yet, he smirked and said, "Then it's not a business, it's a science fair project." 2 months later, I found out he had pitched my idea. I was scrolling through a local business journal online when I saw the headline, "Real Estate Innovator Proposes Ecolink Program for Sustainable Communities." There was a photo of him, polished and smiling, standing in front of a projector screen that displayed my diagrams. The same arrows, the same interface I had shown him on the porch. The name had changed from Greenlink to Ecolink, but everything else was unmistakably mine. I remember staring at the article until the words blurred, reading the quotes attributed to him. "I believe technology can bridge the gap between waste and value," he said. "We're developing a model that will allow small towns to modernize their sustainability practices." I confronted him that evening, shaking with a kind of fury I didn't know I was capable of. He didn't deny it. "Relax," he said, smiling that same practice smile that had always won him clients and family sympathy. "It's not stealing, Liz. You had an idea. I just knew how to make it real. You should be flattered, it means it was good." Flattered. That word hit me harder than the betrayal itself. He talked about my work like it was raw material he had refined, as if my imagination was a quarry he was entitled to mine. And the worst part was that my parents believed him. When I tried to explain what had happened, they said things like, "He's just helping your concept get noticed," and "You should be proud your brother values your creativity." Mom even said, "Maybe you two can work on it together. He has the connections and you have the ideas." But I couldn't bear to be near him after that. The thought of my voice, my passion, turned into the polished vocabulary of his presentations made me feel hollow. He went on to secure a small grant, partnered with a few developers, and within a year Ecolink was featured in a regional magazine as a model of local innovation. He sent me a link with a short text. "See? It's growing. You should have been part of it." I deleted the message without replying. That was when I began to understand something essential about my family. Jonathan was the success story, the embodiment of every sacrifice my parents had made, and Ashley was the polished result, the confirmation that ambition could be beautiful. I was the experiment that made them nervous, the one that didn't follow the script. And in their world, deviation wasn't bravery, it was foolishness. So I kept building. Not that same project, it was too painful, but others, smaller, stranger ones that felt like mine again. I started teaching myself new frameworks, worked with online communities, shared code under pseudonyms, built tools for local co-ops that couldn't afford big software. There were nights when I'd sit alone with a cup of cheap coffee and the hum of my laptop fan, and despite the exhaustion I'd feel that same spark I'd felt at 18. The one that made the rest of the world fade until there was only purpose. Sometimes I think back to that dinner, to the silence that followed my announcement, and I can still feel the air in the room, thick, heavy, disbelieving. My father's voice, my mother's tears, Jonathan's smirk, they all orbit that moment like satellites around a single truth. I chose a path that didn't fit their shape of the world. And even though it cost me their approval, and even though my brother stole the first thing I ever built, I don't regret it. Because in that quiet rebellion, in that act of choosing to walk into the unknown without their permission, I became someone who belonged only to herself. When the news came that Jonathan had won an award for innovation in local sustainability, I didn't shout, didn't call, didn't even cry. I just stared at the article on my cracked phone screen, the image of him holding the plaque in front of a smiling audience, the caption praising his visionary approach to environmental technology. It was the same project, my project, dressed in polished language and a tailored suit. The article even quoted him saying the exact line I had written in my original concept note. "Real progress begins with small communities willing to change." My name, of course, was nowhere near it. I remember sitting on the floor of my apartment, the air conditioner humming weakly above me, feeling as if the entire world had turned on its side. The silence was heavy, pressing into my chest, not with shock but with something colder. A kind of confirmation that this was how things worked, that ideas were currency and I had been foolish enough to spend mine without protection. I thought that would be the worst of it, but then Ashley began to move quietly, efficiently with that same polished precision she used for marketing campaigns. It started small. A few colleagues I'd met at a networking event stopped replying to my emails. One investor who had once shown interest in my early prototype suddenly told me he was reassessing commitments and would circle back. He never did. Then I heard from a friend, someone who had always floated between our families, that Ashley had been telling people I was going through something, that I was emotional, that the stress of failure had unbalanced me. She said it with concern, apparently, the kind of feigned sympathy that sounded like truth to anyone who wanted to believe it. At first I tried to ignore it, to pretend that rumors were just noise that would fade if I stayed focused. But it didn't fade. It spread. Soon I was being left off group threads, skipped over in planning calls, erased from projects I had helped shape. I'd walk into spaces that used to feel open and watch conversations still when I entered. No one said anything cruel to my face, they didn't have to. The withdrawal itself was the cruelty. Even the few people who believed me kept their distance, afraid of being pulled into the gravity of my supposed instability. It was Ashley who finished the job. She called me one night after a panel in San Francisco, her voice calm and honeyed through the phone, as if she were speaking to a client rather than her sister. "Melissa," she said, "you have to let this go. People are starting to worry about you. You're becoming difficult." I remember gripping the edge of the table, my hand shaking. "You spread those rumors," I said. "You told people I was unstable." She sighed in that deliberate way she did when she wanted to sound patient. "I didn't spread anything. I just told them you're struggling. It's obvious, isn't it? You keep chasing things that don't exist. Jonathan's doing real work and you're still in garages with your gadgets. No one believes in girls with garages anymore, Liz. It's not the 90s. Something in me cracked then. Not the kind of crack that makes you collapse, but the kind that lets in air sharp and cold. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just said, "Thank you for making it clear," and hung up. After that, the phone stopped ringing altogether. Within a week I had lost what little foundation I had. The co-working space where I'd been renting a corner desk politely informed me they had to reprioritize local clients. A collaborator I'd been building an app with told me his lawyer advised him not to continue, due to reputational risk. Even the local paper that had once promised a feature on grassroots innovation quietly dropped me from the story. I was erased systematically and neatly, until it felt as though I had never existed in that small circle of opportunity. The apartment grew quieter each day, the walls closing in with every unanswered email. I spent hours refreshing my inbox, staring at the empty space where responses should have been, and then walking aimlessly through the streets just to remind myself that I still occupied physical space somewhere. I started avoiding mirrors because I hated the way I looked. Tired, suspicious, brittle. There was a point where I thought about giving up entirely, maybe taking a job in retail, something simple where no one cared who I was or what I'd lost. But every time I came close to surrendering, I'd think about that call, about Ashley's voice saying, "No one believes in girls with garages," and something raw and electric would flare in my chest. So one night, after selling my old monitor and a few pieces of furniture, I counted the money in an envelope. $407, mostly in worn 20s. I packed my clothes, my notebooks, the hard drive with all my unfinished code, and a stack of printouts that reminded me I had once built something real. I didn't leave a note for anyone. There was no one to leave it for. I took the overnight bus to Los Angeles because it was the cheapest ticket out of Oregon and because I needed a city where no one knew my last name, where failure didn't follow you like a ghost in every coffee shop. The bus was nearly empty, humming through the darkness with that lonely rhythm that makes you feel both small and infinite. I sat by the window, watching the highway blur into a gray ribbon beneath the sodium lights, the rain streaking down in thin, uncertain lines. The hum of the engine became a kind of heartbeat, steady and impersonal, and for the first time in months I felt calm. There was nothing left behind me that I wanted. No family dinners, no forced smiles, no polite invitations that came with invisible conditions. Just the road, the hiss of tires, and the faint promise of something unspoiled waiting at the other end. I arrived in Los Angeles just before dawn. The city smelled like wet asphalt and burnt coffee, neon signs flickering to life as if waking from a long dream. I didn't have a plan beyond survival, but that didn't scare me anymore. I rented a tiny room in a rundown boarding house near Koreatown, walls the color of nicotine, a single window that looked onto a fire escape, and sat cross-legged on the thin mattress with my laptop, typing until the sun crept across the floor. My fingers trembled, but not from fear. It was something else. Determination, hunger, the raw energy that comes from being underestimated one time too many. In those first quiet hours, I promised myself that I would build again, even if it took years, even if no one ever gave me credit. I would write code in borrowed spaces, work from second-hand machines, learn what I didn't know and keep going until the noise of their doubt couldn't reach me anymore. I wasn't running away from them. I was running toward the version of myself they had tried to bury. And as the morning light grew stronger, filling the room with its pale gold, I realized that this isolation wasn't punishment. It was freedom disguised as loss. The first company collapsed before it even had a proper nameplate on the door. I had rented a shared office in a narrow building off Sunset Boulevard, the kind of place where the elevator groaned like an old man and the paint peeled from the corners of the walls, and I convinced myself that the grime was a sign of authenticity, that great ideas were supposed to start in places like that. We were building an energy efficiency app for local households, a system that tracked consumption through smart meters and rewarded users with microcredits for reducing waste. It sounded brilliant when I pitched it, but brilliance doesn't pay cloud storage bills or fix code written by overworked interns. I maxed out 2 credit cards and borrowed money from friends who believed in me because I still sounded like I believed in myself. When the servers crashed one morning and we lost half our user data, the last investor backed out. The email he sent was polite, surgical in its brevity. Regretfully, we cannot proceed at this time. I read it 3 times before shutting the laptop and laying my head on the desk. I remember the smell of burnt coffee and the faint hum of the ceiling fan, and how the sound felt like mockery. The second company died slower, like a body refusing to give up. It was supposed to be a marketplace for sustainable suppliers, a bridge between small eco-friendly producers and buyers who wanted transparent sourcing. The idea was good, maybe even ahead of its time, but the logistics were a labyrinth. I didn't have the network or the capital, or the stamina to keep chasing shipping partners who wanted payment terms longer than our lifespan. There were weeks when I lived on instant noodles and vending machine coffee, nights when I slept on the sofas of acquaintances who had spare corners in their apartments. Every time I moved my backpack from one couch to another, I promised myself that this would be the last stop before things turned around. But things didn't turn around. They spun in circles until I lost my sense of direction completely. Debt collected like dust. Friends stopped answering my text. Some of them had lent me money, others had simply grown tired of my endless optimism that always soured into apology. I remember one evening standing in line at a food truck, counting coins in my palm and realizing I didn't have enough for a meal. It wasn't tragedy, it was arithmetic. I walked away before it was my turn and sat on a bench, the sound of sizzling meat and laughter drifting through the air, and for the first time, I wondered if I had made a mistake too big to undo. But the thought didn't last. I woke up the next morning and opened my laptop again because that was the only thing I knew how to do. Keep building, keep typing, keep trying. The third idea came quietly, like something half-remembered from a dream. It started when I was helping a friend in Ventura with a local farm co-op, watching them struggle to estimate their carbon footprint for grant applications. The process was manual, fragmented, and prone to errors. I began sketching algorithms that could automate emission tracking for small and mid-sized agricultural operations, using sensor data and machine learning to predict environmental output in real time. It was simple in concept, impossible in execution, and exactly the kind of problem that made my brain ignite. I coded for months from a folding chair in a sublet garage, my laptop balanced on a wooden crate. I used free APIs, begged for test data, and sold my old camera to cover patent filing fees. There were nights when I fell asleep sitting upright, my fingers still resting on the keyboard. When the provisional patent finally came through, an email from the United States Patent and Trademark Office with my name attached to a string of numbers and technical language, I stared at the screen for a long time before realizing my hands were shaking. It wasn't validation from my family or investors or anyone who had doubted me. It was proof that something I made had crossed the line from idea to invention. I called the company Greenspan Tech after the word green and span, the idea of bridging gaps in sustainability. It started with 2 people, then 4, then 8. We didn't have an office. We had a converted storage space with cracked linoleum floors and a smell of old paint, but we had belief, the kind that keeps you upright even when your body wants to fold. I pitched at conferences wearing thrifted blazers, slept in cheap motels, and learned how to sound confident even when my voice trembled. Slowly, the right people began to listen. A small venture firm out of San Diego agreed to fund a pilot project with almond farms in the Central Valley. When our first client reported a measurable drop in their carbon offset costs, I felt something inside me lift. A quiet, wordless vindication. 6 months later, we were approached by a mid-sized agricultural tech conglomerate that wanted to acquire us. The offer came in an email so formal it felt unreal. I forwarded it to our legal advisor, expecting him to tell me it was a mistake. Instead, he called me the next morning and said, "Melissa, they're serious." I didn't know how to react. I laughed first, then cried, then sat perfectly still for a long time while the sunlight moved slowly across the floor. The deal closed in late autumn. The number, $38 million, didn't look real even when I saw it printed in the final documents. I stayed on as CEO with a retained equity share that guaranteed I'd never have to worry about rent or grocery bills again, but what mattered more was the sense of arrival. When the news hit the press, my inbox filled again. People I hadn't heard from in years, old contacts suddenly remembering my name. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same world that had once erased me was now trying to claim a piece of my success. But I didn't respond right away. I spent that night alone in my apartment, the same one where I'd once eaten canned soup and cried over rejection emails, and I opened a window to let the city air in. The sound of traffic below mixed with the soft buzz of my computer fan, and I thought about every failure, every couch I'd slept on, every doubt I had swallowed and turned into motion. The money mattered, the recognition mattered, but more than that, the fact that I had built something real from the wreckage of everything that had gone wrong, that mattered most of all. For a long time after the acquisition, I told no one. The morning the deal closed, my phone buzzed with messages from lawyers, accountants, and investors, and when the final wire transfer landed, the numbers on the screen didn't look like money, they looked like coordinates to a different universe. I sat at my kitchen table staring at them until the glow from my laptop faded into the gray of early dawn, and in that soft light, I realized how quiet triumph can be when no one else knows it exists. I didn't post, didn't celebrate, didn't even buy anything extravagant. I went for a walk instead, down a side street lined with jacaranda trees whose fallen blossoms turned the pavement violet, and I thought about how small my old apartment looked from the outside. It felt like the first secret I had ever owed entirely to myself. I kept working, of course. Greenspan Tech had merged into a larger structure, but I stayed as CEO, guiding the transition, managing the team, and learning to navigate the language of mergers and acquisitions. The polished smiles, the contracts with clauses nested like Russian dolls, the endless parade of consultants in perfect suits. I learned to say phrases like strategic realignment and capital liquidity with a calmness that sounded native. And through it all, I said nothing to my family. Not a word. Jonathan called me one evening out of nowhere, his tone cheerful but strained, the way it gets when he wants something. "Hey Liz," he said, dragging out the nickname he used to mock. "I heard you've been quiet. How's life? Still trying to find your footing?" I told him things were fine, that I was consulting here and there, nothing major. He paused for a moment, then said, I could use an assistant. Someone I trust. Real estate's booming and you'd get to learn the ropes." I remember biting my tongue until I tasted metal, forcing my voice into a polite shape. "That's kind of you, but I'm doing all right," I said, keeping my tone steady. "Besides, you'd probably fire me in a week for insubordination." He laughed, not realizing I wasn't joking. A few days later, a box arrived at my office with Ashley's handwriting on the label. Inside were 2 designer blouses, pressed and folded neatly with a note clipped to one sleeve. "For interviews, sister. Hope they bring you luck." The note was written in her perfect looping script, the same one she used for holiday cards. The same deliberate kindness that always carried a faint aftertaste of superiority. I sat there for a long time looking at the fabric, the silk cool under my fingers, thinking how easily they had both built entire narratives about me. One of struggle, of unfinished ambition, of the sister who never quite made it. I smiled, folded the clothes back into the box and sent a short message. "Thank you, Ash. They're lovely." That was all. Silence became my favorite currency. While they talked about promotions and mortgages and the price of tuition, I stayed quiet, nodding when they spoke, letting them fill the air with the noise of their certainty. They never asked many questions about what I did, maybe because they preferred the version of me that needed advice. When I visited home for the holidays, Jonathan would clap me on the shoulder and say, "You should think about real estate. There's real money in that." And Ashley would pour wine and ask if I was still experimenting with those eco-apps. I'd smile and say, "Something like that," and change the subject. It was easier that way. Behind the quiet, though, life was blooming into something vast and secret. I had begun funding water purification projects in small towns across Indiana, helping rural communities replace corroded pipes and install solar filtration units. The first time I visited one of those towns, a man with hands cracked from years of farm work shook mine and said, "You don't look like a donor." I laughed and told him that was the point. Later, I started working with a group in Kenya, financing the construction of low-cost irrigation systems. We didn't use my name. The paperwork listed a foundation with an unremarkable title, one that no one could trace back to me. The anonymity felt purer, freer. To give without the noise of gratitude or expectation was a luxury I didn't know I had been craving. Sometimes I would sit late at night on my balcony in Los Angeles, the city lights flickering below like a restless ocean, and scroll through the reports from those projects. The photos of children carrying clear water in reused bottles, the updates from engineers about soil restoration. Those images did something for me that the acquisition never could. They filled the space that used to ache. Every wire transfer, every blueprint, every anonymous donation was a quiet rebellion against everything my family had once believed about me. I wasn't trying to prove them wrong anymore. I simply wanted to exist outside their language of worth. Still, there were moments when the irony made me laugh aloud. I would get calls from Ashley complaining about how exhausting her charity events were, wine tastings, photo ops, donors who only showed up for the cameras, and she'd sigh dramatically and say, Sometimes I wish people cared as much as they pretend to. I'd murmur agreement while reviewing the latest financial statement for a hospital wing my foundation had just funded under another name. Jonathan, on the other hand, liked to talk about giving back whenever he made a large commission, donating small sums to public school programs and forwarding the receipts in the family group chat. "We've got to support the community," he'd say. I'd send a thumbs-up emoji and move on. Keeping the secret became its own discipline, a daily practice of restraint. I didn't flaunt anything. No new car, no luxury apartment, no curated lifestyle. I still wore the same leather jacket with the worn cuffs, still shopped at the same grocery store where I used to count coins. The only indulgence I allowed myself was time. Long mornings without alarms, afternoons spent walking through neighborhoods where no one knew who I was, evenings reading on park benches while the sky turned gold. There was power in being underestimated, I realized. They still saw me as the youngest, the dreamer, the one who never followed through, and that perception gave me a kind of invisibility that money could never buy. I could sit across from investors, government officials, and corporate leaders, all of them assuming I was just another consultant, while I quietly negotiated projects that would change entire regions. I could be in a room full of people talking about success and never once need to announce mine. In the end, I learned that wealth, when stripped of noise and display, becomes something different, an instrument rather than an identity. It wasn't about proving anything to Jonathan or Ashley or anyone else who had dismissed me. It was about creating something that existed beyond their comprehension, something they couldn't categorize or diminish. And as I moved through that double life, Melissa Carter, the quiet sister with potential, and the woman funding clean water halfway across the world, I found a strange, serene satisfaction in knowing that for the first time in my life, I didn't need to explain myself to anyone. I took the regular flight, the kind with narrow seats and the faint smell of recirculated air and instant coffee, because there was something grounding in the ordinary, something that reminded me who I used to be before numbers and contracts and signatures began to define the scale of my life. Rachel, my assistant, tried to talk me into booking business class even just for comfort, but I told her no, that I wanted to keep things simple. Before I left, she looked at the backpack I slung over my shoulder, the same one I'd carried through my broke years in Los Angeles, its fabric faded and marked with old coffee stains, and shook her head in disbelief. "Melissa," she said, her voice caught somewhere between amusement and confusion, "you have millions sitting in your account and you're still traveling with that thing?" I zipped it up and smiled. "Because that's exactly how they expect to see me," I said. She didn't understand at first, but she didn't press. The airport in Portland looked the same as it always had, that bland, timeless palette of glass and carpet and quiet announcements. I moved through it unnoticed, no designer luggage, no entourage, just me and the bag that had carried my old laptop and the first prototype that no one believed in. The car ride to Harmony Hills was long. The sky stretched gray and low, the fields sleeping under the weight of late autumn. Every mile closer to that house brought back a familiar ache, the feeling of stepping into a story that had already decided my role. Jonathan was the one who came to pick me up. I spotted his SUV before I saw him, gleaming like a mirror on wheels, parked in front of the arrival zone where he stood with his hands in his pockets, scanning the crowd with the casual impatience of someone used to being waited on. When his eyes landed on me, his mouth twitched into that half-smile I remembered from every childhood argument we'd ever had. "Still wearing that same sweater?" he said as I approached. "I can lend you money for a new one if you're holding out for a sale." His voice was light, teasing, but there was always that edge beneath it, the reflex to measure worth in fabric and polish. I smiled back without rising to it. "It's comfortable," I said simply and got into the car. The drive to our parents' house was quiet except for the hum of the tires and the faint sound of his playlist, smooth and curated, the soundtrack of a man proud of his own sophistication. He asked a few perfunctory questions about my consulting work, his tone carrying that faintly condescending curiosity he reserved for things he didn't understand but wanted to judge anyway. I gave short answers, watching the landscape slide by, the hills that had once felt endless shrinking under the weight of memory. When we turned onto the street where I'd grown up, I caught the faint scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney and felt a knot tighten in my chest. Nothing about the view had changed, not the picket fences, not the way the light hit the old trees, not even the cracks in the road that Dad used to curse at every winter. Mom met me at the door, her hair thinner now, her smile still soft. She looked at me the way only mothers do, with love that holds both pride and worry in equal measure. "Lissy," she said, her voice trembling just a little, "you must be starving." Before I could answer, she reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a folded bill. "Here," she said, pressing $50 into my hand. "Get yourself some groceries while you're here. There's not much in the fridge." For a moment I wanted to tell her she didn't need to do that I could buy the whole store if I wanted to, but the tenderness in her gesture stopped me. I smiled, closed my fingers around the bill and said, Thanks, Mom. The house smelled exactly as it always had, of lemon polish, laundry detergent, and the faint sweetness of old paper. Dad was asleep in his chair by the window, the television murmuring softly, and for a moment watching his slow, rhythmic breathing, I felt the sharp sting of time's cruelty. Ashley wasn't there yet, but her presence was everywhere. On the counter where she had left a basket of neatly arranged vitamins for Mom, in the vase of perfect flowers that didn't quite belong in the worn kitchen. Jonathan carried my small suitcase upstairs and lingered in the doorway of my old room, looking around at the posters still curling at the corners, the stack of dusty books, the ghost of my younger self frozen in the clutter. Still feels like a museum to teenage rebellion, he said. I laughed softly, not because it was funny but because the sound of my laughter was the easiest way to keep peace. It's fine, I said, setting my bag down by the bed. It's just for a few days. When he left, I sat on the edge of the bed and unfolded the $50 bill. It was creased, worn, and smelled faintly of the house itself, of the years that had passed in my absence. I thought of the irony. The woman who had signed off on multi-million-dollar projects now sitting in her childhood bedroom, holding a 50 from her mother like a blessing. And yet it didn't sting. It felt strangely right, humbling in a way that anchored me. I wasn't here as the CEO of Greenspan Tech or the anonymous donor funding hospitals and wells. I was just the youngest daughter, the one who had left and come back, carrying the same backpack and wearing the same sweater. That evening we sat around the dinner table as if nothing had changed. Mom talked about the neighbors, Jonathan checked his messages between bites, and the clock in the corner ticked the same slow rhythm it always had. I kept my silence, smiling when expected, nodding when spoken to, blending into the old patterns like I had never left. They still saw the version of me they had built long ago, the one who couldn't quite keep up, who needed help, who was harmless in her quietness. And that was exactly what I wanted them to see. Because beneath the surface of that ordinary dinner, beneath the laughter and the old habits, I carried a secret so vast it felt like a second heartbeat, steady and private. The truth of who I had become didn't need to fit inside this house. It was enough to sit there, unnoticed, in the same sweater and the same chair, knowing that I had built a life none of them could imagine, and that I didn't need them to. Ashley arrived just before sunset, the sound of her car rolling up the driveway as precise and deliberate as everything else she did. Through the window I saw her step out in a tailored coat that shimmered faintly under the porch light, her hair caught in that expensive kind of perfection that looks effortless but never is. She was carrying a stack of elegantly wrapped boxes, each one tagged with tidy handwriting and small gold bows that seemed to glint with self-assurance. When she came in, the air changed, her perfume sharp and floral, slicing through the quiet scent of home-cooked food. I brought a few little things, she announced, setting the gifts down on the dining table as though presenting offerings. She handed Dad a bottle of wine wrapped in velvet, an imported vintage whose label I recognized from one of those glossy articles about collectible vineyards. It's from Napa, she said brightly. Limited edition. I thought it might pair well with dinner. Dad blinked at the bottle, his expression distant, as if unsure whether to open it or worship it. For Mom there was a cashmere scarf, pale blue and soft as fog, draped over her shoulders before she could protest. You deserve something beautiful, Ashley said, adjusting the ends with a careful touch that somehow managed to look both tender and performative. Jonathan received a leather wallet embossed with his initials. For the dealmaker, she teased, and he laughed, that loud confident laugh that filled the whole room and seemed to set its own rhythm. Then she turned to me. The last box was smaller, light, wrapped in glossy paper with a bow tied just slightly askew. She smiled, that same polished smile that could pass for warmth if you didn't look too closely, and handed it to me. For you, Mel, she said. Just a little something I thought might help. I peeled the paper slowly, already bracing for what would be inside. It was a gift card, bright, cheerful, unmistakably from a discount retail chain. Tucked beside it was a note in her flowing handwriting. For interviews, dear. You need to make an impression on potential employers. She said it out loud as I read, her tone light, her eyes sparkling with the satisfaction of someone who believed she was being generous. I smiled because that's what I had learned to do. Thank you, Ash. That's really thoughtful. The words tasted like metal, but they came out smooth. Mom looked at me with a quick, nervous glance, as if she could feel the quiet tension but didn't know how to diffuse it. Jonathan had already moved on, pouring wine for everyone, swirling his glass like a man playing his own reflection. Dinner began the way it always did, with their stories filling every space, their voices layering over one another like instruments in an orchestra that didn't need a conductor. Jonathan talked about a new client, a tech developer from Seattle who wanted to buy property overlooking the hills. It's a big one, he said, his tone modest but his grin betraying the thrill of the commission. Ashley leaned forward, eager to tell her own version of success. A new campaign her firm had just launched for a luxury brand, the way her team had hit record numbers, the upcoming gala in San Francisco she was co-hosting. The founder of Ecolink will be there, she said, glancing at me with the faintest smirk, knowing exactly which nerve that name would touch. I kept my expression neutral, the smile steady, my fingers tracing the rim of my glass. When the conversation turned to me, it wasn't really curiosity that drove it. It was habit, the family's unspoken ritual of checking whether I had finally found my place among them. So, Jonathan began, setting his glass down, what are you working on these days? Still tinkering with those, what did you call them, eco-apps? Ashley chuckled softly, reaching for her fork. She's so creative, she said in that particular tone that made the word sound like naive. I told her she should start taking small contracts. Something simple like app maintenance or content updates. She's great with design, right? I nodded, letting their assumptions build the version of me they wanted. Something like that, I said quietly. Freelance work keeps me busy. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, satisfaction lighting up his face. Well, that's good, he said. Maybe we can help. I know a guy who needs a simple real estate app. Basic listings, nothing fancy. You could take that on. Keep it practical. Ashley smiled, always ready to turn condescension into charity. See? Even John wants to help. It's just about staying consistent, Mel. Maybe get a little routine going. I actually thought, if we all pitch in, we could set up a monthly fund for you. Just something to help you stay on your feet. She looked to Jonathan, who nodded in easy agreement, and then to Mom, who was already fumbling for words of gratitude. $800 a month, Ashley said. That should cover essentials while you focus on your projects. You can use it however you need. The way she said it, soft, careful, managerial, made it clear that in her mind this was both kindness and control. I could feel the heat creeping up my neck, but I kept my voice steady. That's very generous, I said, my tone perfectly flat. Thank you. I knew how to mask disbelief now, how to tuck dignity beneath politeness. There was a strange kind of freedom in pretending, letting them mistake my silence for acceptance. The rest of the evening played out like a scene from a movie I'd seen too many times. The wine flowed, their laughter rose and fell in rehearsed rhythms, and I watched the familiar choreography of my family's hierarchy unfold. The way Jonathan always steered the conversation back to himself, the way Ashley filled silences with stories that sounded like advertisements, the way Mom smiled through all of it, eager to keep peace. Dad sat at the end of the table, his fork moving slowly, his eyes drifting somewhere beyond the room, and I wondered if he still heard the echoes of what this house used to sound like before ambition became our only language. When dessert came, a pie Ashley had brought from some bakery that charged more than it should, I excused myself under the pretense of checking my phone. In the hallway, away from their voices, I took a deep breath and let the facade slip for just a moment. The walls around me were lined with family photos. Jonathan in a suit shaking hands with clients, Ashley at a charity gala, Mom and Dad smiling in better years. In the middle of the wall, there was one of me at 16, holding a trophy from a science fair, my grin wide, unguarded, certain that brilliance alone was enough to carry me somewhere. I stared at that picture for a long time before I returned to the table. They didn't notice I'd been gone. Ashley was talking about a new investment portfolio, Jonathan was comparing market rates, and Mom was laughing softly at something neither of them had said for her benefit. I sat back down, folded my hands in my lap and smiled again, the same practice smile I'd worn all night. In that moment I understood something simple but sharp. They needed to believe in the version of me they had invented, the one who never quite measured up, because that version made their own successes shine brighter. And so I let them have it. I let them offer their charity, their advice, their carefully packaged concern. They could keep their $800 and their gift cards and their shallow kindness. I didn't need to correct them, didn't need to remind them who I had become. The truth was already mine, and I carried it quietly, invisibly, like the faint glint of a blade hidden beneath velvet. It happened late in the evening, after the dinner plates had been stacked in the sink and the conversation had settled into the soft domestic murmur that fills a house when everyone thinks the day is done. I had excused myself earlier, pretending to be tired, but sleep wouldn't come, so I wandered quietly into the hallway. The light from the kitchen spilled in a narrow stripe across the wooden floor, and I could hear voices, Ashley's low and deliberate, Jonathan's steady and practical. I should have turned away, but something in the tone of Ashley's voice stopped me. It wasn't the polished, public tone she used for show. It was quieter, heavier with intent. I took a step closer, careful to stay in the shadow of the doorway. Their words carried easily through the half-open door, sharp and clear against the hum of the refrigerator. "We'll give her something," Ashley was saying. "A little support, enough that she doesn't feel like a burden. But we keep control of it. That way she can't go off making bad decisions again." Jonathan made a soft sound of agreement, A low chuckle that had no warmth in it. Right. She's not in a position to argue anyway. No real income, no savings, no options. It's better this way, she'll think it's generosity and we'll make sure everything stays manageable. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The words slid into me like cold water, washing away the last trace of illusion I had allowed myself to hold. All the polite smiles, all the subtle patronizing comments, the gift cards and the offers of help, they weren't misguided gestures of concern. They were a strategy. I realized with the slow and bitter clarity of someone waking from a long sleep, that they had built a small, controlled version of me in their minds, a dependent shadow they could pity and manage because that made them feel safe. It wasn't enough for them that I had failed once. They needed me to stay failed, contained, predictable. Ashley's voice broke through again, calm and precise. We'll make the transfers monthly just like we said. It'll keep her close. And if she starts talking about those startup ideas again, we'll gently steer her away. Remind her of what happened last time. She listens when it sounds like advice. Jonathan laughed softly. Yeah, poor Mel. Still chasing those garage dreams. But you're right. This way she won't embarrass herself. Or us. The silence that followed felt dense, like the air itself had weight. I stood there, my hand against the wall, my heart hammering not with sadness but with something cleaner, sharper, resolve. Every humiliation, every underestimation, every carefully veiled insult I had swallowed over the years coalesced into that single instant of understanding. They didn't just think I was weak, they needed me to be weak. It made their world tidy, their reflection flawless. I straightened slowly, the chill in my body replaced by a stillness so complete it felt almost like calm. The tile under my bare feet was cold, grounding, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly the only sound that seemed to belong to the real world. I thought about the years I had spent building everything they believed I had lost, the nights spent coding until dawn, the contracts I had signed, the quiet empire I had built without applause. They had erased me once before, turned my silence into proof of failure, but now my silence would mean something else entirely. It would be strategy. I turned away from the door and walked back to my room with deliberate slowness, careful not to let the floorboards creak. My reflection in the darkened window caught my eye. The same sweater, the same tired face they had always seen, but behind it I could almost sense the invisible architecture of everything they didn't know. It was strange how easy it was to feel nothing in that moment. No rage, no heartbreak, just a kind of measured certainty. They thought they were managing me, but they had no idea they were walking straight into the story I would write next. When I reached my room, I closed the door softly and sat on the edge of the bed. The house was silent again, but the echo of their voices lingered, shaping itself into something precise inside me. I folded my hands in my lap, steady, my breathing even, and began to think. I didn't pace, didn't reach for my phone, didn't need to. The plan came naturally, quiet and complete, as if it had been waiting all along for this moment to surface. I would keep smiling, keep nodding, keep being exactly who they believed I was. For now. They had written me off as powerless, and that would be their blind spot. I glanced at the old family photograph on the dresser. Jonathan in his suit, Ashley mid-laugh, me standing slightly off to the side, my smile small, almost apologetic. I studied that younger version of myself, the one they had frozen in their memories, and felt something like tenderness. She had survived long enough to become the woman sitting here now, calm, patient, and utterly in control of what came next. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees, carrying the faint rustle of dry leaves across the roof. The house, for all its pretense of warmth, felt hollow, every surface polished to disguise the cracks underneath. But I knew now exactly where those cracks were and how deep they ran. When I finally lay back on the bed, I felt a strange peace settle over me, as if a long-held weight had finally dissolved. They thought I had no options. They thought they still held the power to define who I was. But they were wrong. I had stopped needing their belief a long time ago. Now I would use their disbelief, their blindness, their certainty, as the quietest, sharpest weapon I had ever owned. And when the time came, I would let the truth unfold not in anger but in precision. For the first time in years I slept soundly. Morning came with that brittle brightness particular to early winter, the light slanting through the kitchen windows in thin, cold stripes that made the air look sharper than it felt. The smell of coffee drifted faintly through the house, mingled with the comforting hum of routine, as if the tension of the night before had never existed. Ashley was already at the table, perfectly put together as always, scrolling through her phone with one manicured hand and stirring sugar into her mug with the other. Jonathan stood by the window talking about mortgage rates, his voice carrying that confident rhythm that had once filled every silence I didn't know how to break. I walked in quietly, the same sweater, the same backpack slung over one shoulder. Ashley looked up and smiled, that brittle, immaculate kind of smile that always felt like a test. "Morning, Mel," she said brightly, setting her phone down. "Did you sleep? You look exhausted." Want me to call you a cab later? Or is the bus still your thing? Jonathan chuckled without looking up. You should really let me give you a ride. Wouldn't want your car to break down again. The two of them laughed in tandem, a small, well-rehearsed duet of superiority. I poured myself coffee, unbothered, letting the moment hang in the air long enough to feel its weight. Actually, I said softly, someone's picking me up. Ashley raised an eyebrow. Another taxi? She teased, her tone sugar-coated with disbelief. You always have these mysterious plans. Should I expect an Uber XL this time? She laughed again, tilting her head toward Jonathan, who smirked in agreement. I took a sip of coffee and checked my watch. Something like that, I said. Then I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my contacts and tapped Rachel's name. The call was brief. 5 minutes, I said. The lawn's clear. Ashley went back to her phone, distracted. Jonathan continued talking about a new deal he was closing, and Mom was rinsing dishes at the sink, humming softly under her breath. Outside, the world looked ordinary, gray sky, bare branches, the grass dull with dew. Then somewhere in the distance a sound began to rise. Low at first, a faint rhythmic thump, steady as a heartbeat. Jonathan paused mid-sentence, frowning, glancing toward the window. The sound grew louder, richer, expanding through the air until the cups on the table began to tremble. The walls seemed to hum. Ashley looked up, confused. What on earth is that? She said, standing, her voice half laughing, half anxious. But I already knew the answer. I'd heard that sound enough times to recognize it before anyone else did. The thudding deepened, a mechanical growl swelling into the full, unmistakable roar of rotor blades. Shadows swept across the curtains as wind pressed against the glass. And then, as if a dream had slipped into the waking world, a sleek black helicopter came into view above the yard, its polished body cutting through the sky like a blade of obsidian. The machine hovered for a second, stirring the air into a violent shimmer, the grass bowing in circles beneath it, and then it began to descend, its landing skids touching the ground with a precision that looked almost graceful. The noise filled every corner of the house. Napkins fluttered off the table, the curtains billowed inward. Mom's hand flew to her mouth. Jonathan just stood there, motionless, his face a strange mix of disbelief and calculation, as if he were trying to fit the scene into a version of reality that made sense. Ashley, on the other hand, went completely pale. Melissa, she shouted over the noise, what is happening? I finished my coffee, set the cup down and turned toward them. My voice was calm, steady, the same even tone I had used when agreeing to their plans the night before. It's for me, I said. For a second no one moved. The words hung there, half swallowed by the roar outside. Then Ashley blinked, her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Jonathan looked from me to the window, his mouth slightly open, his composure cracking in slow motion. Mom gasped softly, her eyes wide not with fear but with a kind of awe. I walked to the front door and opened it. The cold air rushed in, filled with the smell of earth and jet fuel, the grass still whipping in small spirals. The pilot stepped out, tall, uniformed, headset still around his neck. He caught my eye, nodded once and motioned toward the open cabin. Behind me, I could feel the weight of their gazes. Ashley frozen, Jonathan trying to recover his sense of superiority, Mom clutching her scarf. Ashley's voice finally broke through, shrill and shaky. That can't be real, she said, almost laughing, but the sound was thin. You're joking. Whose is that? I turned to her, meeting her eyes with the same quiet smile I'd been perfecting for years. It's mine, I said. Jonathan let out a small, disbelieving laugh. Yours? Since when do you? He stopped himself, the question collapsing under the obviousness of what he was seeing. The pilot took my bag from my shoulder, setting it gently beside the cabin door. The helicopter blades slowed slightly, their rhythmic chop turning into a steady hum. The wind tugged at my hair, lifted the edge of my sweater. For a long moment no one spoke. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. I glanced at Mom, whose eyes had softened, her hand still pressed against her chest. She looked smaller than I remembered, framed by the doorway and the noise, her expression caught between confusion and pride. You'll catch cold, she said automatically, her voice breaking just a little. I smiled at her. I'll be fine, I said and meant it. When I stepped onto the lawn, the grass flattened beneath my shoes, the wind pulling at my sleeves. Behind me the others had followed, drawn by disbelief, maybe by something heavier. Ashley stood a few paces back, her face pale, her eyes darting between the helicopter and me like she was trying to decide whether to be impressed or humiliated. Jonathan had gone quiet, his mouth set in a thin line, hands shoved into his pockets, every trace of arrogance erased by confusion. I turned to them, the roar of the blades filling the silence between us, the air vibrating with energy. Take care of Mom and Dad, I said. The words were simple, calm, but they felt heavier than any speech I could have given. And then without waiting for a response I stepped toward the open cabin, the pilot steadying my arm as I climbed in. As the door closed, I caught one last glimpse through the tinted glass. Ashley's expression frozen mid-collapse, Jonathan's hand lifting instinctively as if to shield his eyes, Mom's small figure framed by the doorway, her scarf fluttering in the wind. The helicopter lifted, slow at first, then faster, the lawn shrinking below, the house turning into a neat little rectangle surrounded by trees. The higher we rose, the quieter it felt inside, the sound of the blades softening into a rhythmic pulse. I looked down at the place that had built me and buried me in equal measure, and for the first time, it no longer looked like something I needed to escape. It just looked small and far away and perfectly still. The flight lasted less than half an hour, but it felt like crossing into another world. Through the window, the landscape unfolded in broad strokes of gold and green, rolling hills, lines of grapevines etched across the earth like deliberate handwriting, the shimmer of irrigation ponds glinting under the sun. As the helicopter descended, the estate came into view, a stretch of land spreading out over 25 acres, the kind of view that swallows words. The main house stood at the center, modern but warm, its glass walls reflecting the light like water, surrounded by rows of vineyards that curved into the distance. Beyond it, the smaller buildings glowed softly in the morning haze, barns converted into research facilities, solar arrays tilted toward the sky, the faint outline of the Greenspan Tech headquarters rising like a quiet testament to years of work no one had believed I was capable of. When the helicopter settled on the landing pad, the rotors slowed, and the silence that followed was almost reverent. I unbuckled my harness and stepped out first, the wind tugging at my hair, the smell of earth and grapes rising to meet me. Behind me, I heard the hesitant crunch of footsteps, Jonathan's first, then Ashley's, then Mom's slower, careful tread. They stood together, staring, their eyes moving over the expanse of the property with disbelief so raw it almost looked like pain. The glass facade of the main building caught the light and threw it back at them like a mirror. Jonathan was the first to find his voice. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his tone sharp, the practiced calm he always wore cracking open. "Somebody's house. Rental? What is going on, Melissa?" He looked at me as if waiting for a confession, as if there must still be some trick, some illusion that could explain it. I turned toward him, calm, steady, my voice even. "This," I said, gesturing to the space around us, "is my office. My company. My home." For a moment no one spoke. The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended between the truth and their disbelief. Ashley blinked several times, her lips parting soundlessly. This is yours," she stammered. "You mean you work here?" Her eyes darted to the sign by the entrance. Greenspan Tech, etched into steel, clean and unpretentious. The logo she had probably seen in passing in some article she hadn't read all the way through. "You're saying you built this?" "I didn't just build it," I said quietly. "I own it." Jonathan let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You own this?" He gestured around wildly. This is corporate money. These things cost millions." His voice cracked on the last word, and I could see the color rising in his face, disbelief curdling into anger. "You're lying. This isn't real." Instead of answering, I walked toward the main building, my footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The others followed almost involuntarily, their curiosity too strong to stop them. When the doors opened, the cool air from inside washed over us, carrying the faint scent of eucalyptus and steel. The lobby stretched out in clean lines and open space, sunlight pouring through high windows. There were desks, workstations, green walls lined with plants, a row of plaques on one side. The patent certificates, the acquisition documents, framed and hung without vanity, just quiet proof. I watched Jonathan's eyes catch on the patent number beneath my name. The same number that once existed only in a file on a dying laptop in a Los Angeles garage. "That's my first one," I said. "Emission tracking for agricultural systems. I sold the parent company, but Greenspan Tech remained mine. We expanded." Ashley's gaze was darting from detail to detail, the comprehension slowly dawning but refusing to settle. "You're serious," she whispered finally. "You actually did it." Her voice trembled not with admiration but confusion, as if the reality in front of her refused to fit inside the story she had told herself about me. Jonathan turned toward me, his expression caught between fury and disbelief. "You let us sit there last night talking about helping you," he said, his voice rising. "You let us offer you money." "Yes," I said simply. "I did." He stepped closer, his face tightening. "Why? To humiliate us?" I shook my head. "No. To understand you." Ashley sank into one of the lobby chairs, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her skirt. "Then why all this secrecy?" she asked quietly. "Why hide it from us?" I looked at her, really looked, and saw not cruelty but a kind of bewildered fragility. Because I needed to know whether you cared about me or just about the version of me you built to feel better about yourselves, I said. My tone was calm, almost gentle. You've always measured love by control. I wanted to see what happened when I stopped needing either. They didn't answer. The silence between us was heavier than any accusation. I walked over to a side table where a stack of documents waited, neatly arranged. I picked up the top file and held it out toward them. This, I said, is the Astor Foundation. We fund clean water systems, sustainable agriculture, and, more relevant to you, we've been covering the full cost of Mom and Dad's care for the past 2 years. Jonathan blinked, his anger faltering. What do you mean, covering the cost? I opened the folder and showed them the statements. Payments made directly to the hospital, receipts from home care services, insurance renewals, all under the foundation's name. Every medical bill. Every therapist. Every piece of equipment in their house. All of it. You didn't notice because you didn't bother to check where the invoices were going after they stopped arriving. Ashley's eyes widened. But we thought, Dad said Jonathan was handling the payments. I met her gaze. You thought wrong. The foundation paid through an intermediary. I didn't want you to feel obligated. I just wanted them to be safe. Jonathan took the papers from my hand, scanning them, his expression shifting from skepticism to something closer to shame. You're telling me you've been paying for everything? Yes, I said. Quietly. Because they needed it. And because even after everything I still love them. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the building, the quiet whir of air vents, the distant buzz of machinery from the lab wing. Outside, the vineyards shimmered in the afternoon light, endless and orderly. Ashley finally stood, her voice small. You could have told us. I could have, I said. But if I had, would you have believed me? She didn't answer. Jonathan just looked at me, his jaw tight, his eyes full of something raw and uncertain, maybe the first crack in the armor of certainty he had worn his whole life. Mom stood a little apart from the others, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes bright with something that looked like both pride and sorrow. I didn't want to embarrass you, I said softly. I just wanted you to see me. No one spoke. They just stood there, surrounded by the evidence of everything I had built from the pieces they had left behind, the truth shining as plainly as the glass walls around us. Outside, the sun slipped lower, the vines catching its light, and for the first time the silence between us wasn't cruel. It was honest. The silence that followed felt almost fragile, as though one wrong movement might shatter it completely. Jonathan stood by the window, his shoulders squared but his expression unsteady, while Ashley sat rigid in the chair where she had sunk, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale. The afternoon light cut across the glass walls, tracing sharp lines across their faces, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped, like we were suspended inside a truth too large to name. It was Ashley who broke first. She blinked rapidly, her composure dissolving in uneven breaths until the first tear slipped down her cheek. So that's it, she said, her voice shaking. You brought us here just to show us how wrong we were? To make us feel small? You're happy now, aren't you? You proved your point. Her words came out jagged, caught somewhere between accusation and desperation. I looked at her for a long moment, not with triumph but with a kind of quiet disbelief, because even now, when the evidence surrounded her, she still couldn't see what this was about. Jonathan turned sharply from the window, his voice rising fast and hot. You've humiliated us, he snapped. You let us sit there, offering you money, talking to you like you were struggling. You let us make fools of ourselves. You planned this, didn't you? His face had gone red, a vein visible at his temple, his control fraying at the edges. I stayed still. I didn't plan this, I said evenly. You did that yourselves. Ashley stood abruptly, brushing at her cheeks, her mascara smudging into faint shadows beneath her eyes. You think you're better than us now, she said. You think money makes you right. That success means you can just stand there and lecture us about who we are. Her voice cracked halfway through the sentence and something in it, fear not anger, made me exhale slowly before answering. I don't think I'm better, I said quietly. I think I'm finally free. There's a difference. Jonathan laughed once, a short, hollow sound. Free? You call this freedom? Sitting here flaunting all this, what, pity money? You think because you wrote a few checks and built some eco thing you get to play God? You humiliated us, Mel. I walked toward the desk where the documents still lay in a neat stack. The contracts, the patents, the foundation records. My hands didn't shake as I picked up another folder, thinner but heavier in implication. I placed it gently on the glass table between us. No, Jonathan, I said. I didn't humiliate you. I'm just showing you what you didn't want to see. He frowned, the anger still alive in his eyes. What is that? Your debts, I said. Mortgage extensions, 2 outstanding business loans, and a lien filed 6 months ago on one of your Ridgeview properties. I didn't go looking for it. I heard about it by accident from someone in banking who thought you were expanding again. I paused, my tone calm but deliberate. I made sure the lien was quietly settled through an intermediary before your investors noticed. You never even realized. For a second his face went completely blank. He reached for the folder with a kind of reflex, flipping through the papers, scanning the stamped dates, the signatures. His mouth opened slightly but no sound came out. Then the anger returned, wild and brittle. You had no right, he said. That's my business. Yes, I said, meeting his eyes. And you were about to lose it. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair, and for the first time since I could remember, Jonathan looked smaller. Not physically but in the way people do when certainty drains out of them. The power that had always wrapped around him like armor was gone, leaving behind something raw, uncertain, almost human. Ashley was crying quietly now, her face turned away, but her voice came thinly through the tears. Why would you do that? She whispered. Why would you help us and not tell us? Because telling you would have turned it into a debt, I said softly. And I didn't want anything from you. No one moved. The air in the room had shifted, the polished walls and smooth furniture no longer neutral. They were witnesses now, reflecting every crack in the family myth we had lived inside for so long. Jonathan set the papers down, his hand trembling slightly, his breathing uneven. You're enjoying this, he said, but the words lacked conviction, like he was saying them to fill the space rather than because he believed them. I'm not, I said. You think I wanted it to end this way? That I wanted to have to prove my worth like this? I never wanted to compete with you. I wanted to belong. But you only know how to measure things in wins and losses, so here we are. Ashley let out a shaky breath, pressing her fingers to her temples as if trying to hold herself together. It's not that simple, she said, her voice breaking. We didn't understand you. We thought you were lost. I nodded once. You needed me to be lost, I said. Because if I wasn't, then the story you built around yourselves wouldn't make sense anymore. Jonathan turned away, his reflection in the glass window suddenly looking older, almost haunted. You could have told us, he murmured, but his tone wasn't defiant anymore. It was quiet, almost pleading. I looked at him, my voice steady. Would you have listened? He didn't answer. None of them did. The silence stretched out again, long and heavy, the kind that fills every corner of a room until it becomes another presence. Outside, the sun was slipping lower, washing the hills in a soft amber light that made everything look gentler than it was. Ashley wiped her face with the edge of her sleeve, her shoulders trembling. So what now? She asked. I looked at her, then at Jonathan, at the fragile outlines of the people who had once defined me. Now nothing, I said. You don't owe me and I don't owe you. You can stop trying to fix me and I can stop pretending I need you to. For a long time no one moved. Jonathan's jaw tightened and he looked down at the papers again, the truth staring back at him in ink and numbers. Ashley sniffed, whispering something under her breath that I didn't catch. Mom stood off to the side, her hands clasped, her eyes full of tears she didn't let fall. And then, slowly, the anger drained from the room, leaving behind something quieter, something closer to grief. They weren't furious anymore, not really, they were afraid. Afraid of what it meant that the youngest, the dreamer, the one they had always pitied, had built something larger than any of them had imagined. Afraid that my success didn't just redefine me, it redefined them. I stood there for a while, watching their faces, seeing not enemies but people stripped of the illusions they had worn for years. Their power, their certainty, their superiority. It had all been armor against the same fear I had carried my whole life. The fear of being small. And now standing here it was gone. For the first time I didn't feel anger toward them. I just felt free. They didn't apologize. Not once. There was no sudden confession, no tears of remorse, no admission of what they'd done or what they had been blind to for so long. Instead they did what they had always done. They tried to restore balance in their own favor, to pull the world back into the shape that made sense to them. Ashley wiped her face, her voice still trembling, but her words were the same. You didn't have to make this a spectacle. Jonathan stood with his arms folded, staring at the documents as if by looking hard enough he could erase them. You've made your point, he said. There's no need to rub it in. They didn't want forgiveness. They wanted control of the story again. I looked at them, feeling the distance like a physical thing, something that could be measured in more than just space. Their faces were familiar but foreign now, like portraits of people I had once known but no longer recognized. There was no satisfaction left in me, no anger either, just a kind of exhausted clarity. I'm not trying to look better than you, I said quietly. That's not what this is about. Ashley shook her head, her expression brittle. Then what is it about, Mel? Do you want us to beg? To admit we were wrong? I held her gaze. No, I said. I just want you to understand that I'm done. Jonathan frowned. Done with what? With trying, I said simply. With proving, with pleasing, with pretending. I'm done being the version of me you've kept alive all these years so you could feel right about yourselves. I'm not angry anymore, but I'm not part of this family. Not in the way you think of family. Ashley's mouth opened as if to protest, but no sound came. Jonathan's jaw tightened, his eyes dark and unreadable. That's ridiculous, he said finally. You can't just cut people out. We're blood. Blood, I repeated softly, isn't the same as belonging. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the low murmur of voices from outside, the quiet rhythm of workers in the vineyard, the distant mechanical whir of irrigation lines. I could hear Rachel's footsteps approaching from the far corridor, precise and measured, the sound a small reminder of the world I had built beyond this one. When she entered, she carried a slim black folder under her arm, her expression neutral but expectant. I turned to her. The papers. She nodded, placing them on the table. Everything signed and verified. The transfer is complete. Ashley's eyes flicked toward the folder. What papers? The guardianship documents, I said. Effective immediately, Mom and Dad's care is fully under the Astor Foundation. All expenses, medical or otherwise, are covered indefinitely. You don't need to contribute anymore. You're free of the responsibility you pretended to carry. Mom looked startled, her hands tightening together. Lissy, you didn't have to. I turned to her and softened my voice. I wanted to, Mom. This way you won't have to depend on anyone's schedules or promises. You'll have what you need without asking. Jonathan's voice cut through, sharp and defensive. You're taking them away from us? No, I said. I'm taking the weight off them. And off you. You can visit, you can help if you truly want to, but they'll never again be a burden you use as a way to measure your generosity. Ashley rose from her chair, her movements tense. You can't just decide that for everyone, she said, her tone rising. You don't get to make yourself the savior. I didn't ask to be, I said quietly. You made me the failure. I just stopped believing you. She froze, the words hanging between us, fragile and final. Rachel stood silently at my side, her presence a calm counterpoint to the storm brewing in front of me. I picked up the folder and handed it to her. File these with the foundation this afternoon, I said. Effective date, today. She nodded once, understanding more than the words themselves. Jonathan's voice was quieter now, stripped of its usual confidence. So that's it, he said. You walk away just like that? I looked at him, really seeing him. Not the polished agent, not the confident older brother, but the man behind the facade, uncertain and suddenly small. Yes, I said. That's it. Mom stepped forward, her face soft with confusion and sorrow. Where will you go? Home, I said, and for the first time the word didn't mean their house. Outside, the faint thrum of blades began to build in the distance, a low, rhythmic pulse that gathered strength with each second. Through the glass wall, I could see the black helicopter returning, its reflection flashing across the polished surface of the headquarters. The sound filled the air again, shaking loose papers on the desk, stirring the curtains at the edges of the windows. Ashley flinched, pressing her hands to her ears. Jonathan turned toward the noise, his eyes wide with disbelief that it was real. I reached for my bag, the same weathered backpack now resting against the chair where I had left it, and slung it over my shoulder. Rachel followed me as I walked toward the door. I turned once more to look at them. Jonathan standing rigid, Ashley pale and silent, Mom holding her hands to her chest. Take care of them, I said softly to Rachel, though my eyes stayed on my mother. Everything's in place. Then I turned back to the others. You don't have to understand, I said. Just remember that I gave you the truth even when it didn't fit the story you wanted. I walked outside, the wind from the helicopter beating against my clothes, carrying the scent of earth and sunlight and fuel. The air was wild and loud and cleansing. Rachel reached the aircraft first, speaking briefly to the pilot before turning back to me with a small nod. I climbed aboard without looking back, settling into the seat as the rotors surged into motion. Through the window I saw them still standing there, the three figures framed against the glass of my building, their reflections swallowed by the glare of the sun. The house, the hills, the vineyard, all of it began to shrink as the helicopter lifted off, the noise rising into a steady roar. From above, everything looked smaller again. The neat geometry of the estate, the road curling away into the distance, the faint shimmer of the horizon. I leaned back, eyes closed for a moment, feeling the vibration of the ascent ripple through my bones. There was no triumph in it, no vengeance, just release. The game had ended, and for the first time in my life I was no longer a piece on their board. The flight back to Los Angeles felt different this time, lighter, as if the weight I had carried for years had finally dissolved somewhere over the folds of Oregon's gray hills. The city came into view like a living constellation, streets pulsing with light, the ocean stretching beyond it like a dark mirror. When we landed, the sun was already sliding into the horizon, burning gold at the edges where the sky met the water. Rachel offered to drive me home, but I told her I preferred to walk. I wanted to feel the city again, the warmth, the noise, the pulse of something alive and uncontained. My phone buzzed as I stepped out of the terminal. For a second I thought about turning it over, checking for messages out of habit, but then I remembered that habit itself was what had always bound me to them. I opened my contacts list instead and blocked each number one by one. Jonathan, Ashley. The family group chat. Even the old neighbors from Harmony Hills who still sent cheerful forwards around the holidays. Each name disappeared quietly without fanfare until my screen was clean. It wasn't anger, it was closure. Back in my loft, the ocean filled half my view, its surface catching the last threads of sunlight. The space was high-ceilinged and open, glass and steel softened by light wood and books piled on every surface. Plants reached toward the windows, papers were scattered across my desk, and the faint hum of the city below reminded me that life didn't stop moving just because someone else had stopped believing in you. I slipped off my shoes, walked barefoot to the balcony and leaned against the railing. The air tasted of salt and wind, the same smell that had once meant longing and now meant arrival. For the first time in years I didn't have to perform myself for anyone. There were no expectations pressing against my ribs, no comparisons waiting at the end of every sentence. The world had expanded again, not through wealth or recognition, but through the quiet certainty that I had chosen my own shape and survived in it. News of them reached me indirectly the way gossip always does, through articles, half-whispered conversations in circles that once overlapped with mine. Jonathan's firm had folded within a year. There had been an internal audit, whispers of financial misconduct, deals that didn't stand up to scrutiny once someone started asking questions. His name disappeared from the glossy magazines that had once called him the face of Oregon real estate innovation. The few mutual acquaintances we still shared described him as taking time off, though I suspected it wasn't by choice. Ashley's fall came quieter but deeper. Someone had finally pieced together the story of what she'd done to me years ago. The rumors, the professional sabotage, the lies told so smoothly that they had almost sounded like concern. It wasn't scandalous enough for headlines, but in her world, where image was currency and reputation the only real collateral, it was enough to unravel everything. Her company didn't renew her contract. The charity events stopped inviting her. The same people who once laughed at her jokes began to look away. For her, silence must have been worse than exposure. I didn't celebrate any of it. I didn't need to. Life has its own way of balancing scales, and I had already made peace with mine. My revenge had never been their downfall. It had been my freedom. Most mornings now start the same way. I wake up before dawn when the city still hums softly in its sleep, and I make coffee strong enough to taste the earth in it. Then I sit by the window and watch the sky lighten over the ocean, the waves folding into themselves like pages being turned. Sometimes Rachel calls with updates from the foundation. Another well finished, another rural clinic supplied, another small shift in the world made quietly without applause. Other days I close my laptop and go down to the beach, walking along the edge of the water until the noise in my head quiets completely. I think sometimes about that house in Harmony Hills. The smell of lemon polish and quiet disappointment, the ticking clock that used to measure my failures in seconds. I think about the girl who once sat there, trembling under the weight of her family's expectations, and I wish I could tell her that she didn't have to keep earning her place in rooms that were never meant to hold her. That leaving isn't betrayal when staying means erasing yourself. That silence when chosen is not weakness. It's the sound of a life finally uncluttered by the need to be understood. When night falls, the city glows like a sea of stars turned upside down. From my balcony, I can see the faint reflection of myself in the window. The same face, the same quiet eyes, but freer now, sharper with peace instead of pain. I think about how strange it is that love can survive even after trust dies, that forgiveness can live in the same breath as distance. I don't hate them. I just don't need them. If there's a lesson in all of it, it isn't about money or success or proving anyone wrong. It's about permission, the kind you give yourself when you finally stop asking others for it. It's about realizing that sometimes the people who taught you to doubt yourself will never learn to see you clearly, and that it isn't your job to change their vision. I look out over the ocean, the waves folding and breaking against the shore, endless and indifferent, and I know that this stillness, this independence, this unremarkable peace, is what I had been chasing all along. I used to think freedom would feel like victory, but it doesn't. It feels like exhale. It feels like walking away from the noise and realizing the silence you feared was actually your own voice, waiting to be heard. Sometimes, The kindest thing you can do for yourself is to let the world you outgrew crumble behind you and never look back. And sometimes, the truest form of love is the one you finally turn inward. The quiet, stubborn, unshakable kind that says, I am enough even without you.